Hello, everybody. I'm your host, Zenitsu, and you're listening to the Digitalks podcast, the show that covers various topics from news to meta developments and everything in between for the fine folks who love the Digimon trading card game. Just as a quick reminder, I do stream this live over on twitch.tv/Zenitsu, and it's also uploaded as a YouTube video under the YouTube channel of Zenitsu while being on various podcasting platforms like Spotify for your viewing and listening pleasure. So please feel free to do all of the social media doobly-doos and leave that like, rating, follow, subscribe, review, whatever, depending on the platform that you're listening on. It really does help support the podcast. Today, I am with Jay Stewart. So, Jay Stewart was on the show like once or twice before, so he is coming back. And today, we are going to be talking about Digimon's biggest design flaws. Before we get into that, Jay Stewart, if you want to reintroduce yourself because it has been a while, feel free to do so.
Yeah, so I'm J000. I've been playing the Digimon TCG since BT4, give or take, and I've got a little bit of history of playing Yu-Gi-Oh! And also playing Vanguard Zero, uh, and that's kind of my TCG experience. And lately, I've been making the attempt to try to get a Nationals invite, but I don't think this year will be the year. But I have been doing a lot better than I have in the past. So hopefully, maybe next time around, I'll be getting that invite.
Yeah, because I know you gotten a top 16 store regional, which, if you weren't top 8, then unfortunately you just missed out on that. And then I also know, I think you did top 32 at a different event.
Yeah, so I got 17th place in the Iowa Store Regionals. I I had the same record as everybody else. I made the top 16, which was X2 for that. So it was just kind of luck of the draw of that one.
Yeah, so that's still pretty respectable, at least knowing that you're a decent enough player to get up there, is definitely nice.
Yeah,
It's just the grind. And when I mean the grind, I actually mean it as a grind, especially in specific formats, because matchup luck is and opponent luck is a huge factor. Not saying that you can't be consistently good at this game, because we do have players that are. I'm just saying, speaking from my own personal experience, luck is definitely a huge factor, which adds to the grindy factor.
hmm yeah, that it is. I mean, because you still got to be able to see your a starting hand, and if you just so happen to not, it just kind of all boils down from there.
Yeah, or even just okay, I hope I go into an event not seeing a specific deck, which we'll talk about a little bit more when we actually get into the metadata, because oh boy, we got a lot of metadata to go over. But before we do that, we actually have a question of the week, which kind of ties into the bigger overarching topic, which is what TCG mechanic more specifically do you not find fun? So this could be either in Digimon or out of Digimon, just in a general TCG sense. What do you generally not enjoy playing against?
So for me, I would say it would be more of RAM or just the free value a game could potentially offer. So I'll take for example with my Yu-Gi-Oh example. Um, I quit around like midway through Links when they first came out, and the reason I kind of quit during that was it was kind of a matter of a the game was decided based on a coin flip. Who goes first, and do they see their one card combo that literally gets them 17 bodies or spells and traps on the field that would just stop you from playing the game at all. And if you didn't draw into your, because keep in mind, Yu-Gi-Oh also does have Mulligan. If you just so happen to get your hand counters at that point, which you're kind of paying, you're losing resources out of your hand. So you have to hope you also could, if you can stop your opponent, you can try to bounce back and do your one card combo, assuming they can't out you. And I know Digimon's kind of getting to, I wouldn't say it's getting to the point where it's that problem, but we are kind of seeing more and more cards of, like, for example, BT 12 Greymon, where his effect was, oh, if you don't have Taikamiya on the field, you could play a Taikamiya. Or even the Vortex cards from the uh, Digimon Liberators, because that one says if you have one or less tamers on the field, you could play a Shoto, and there's nothing wrong with those. It's just how lenient are they going to start being about that kind of thing?
I do
Is my
get
concern.
Yeah, I do get where you're coming from because like ramp and rapid resource generation is always the most dangerous thing you could play with in TCGs because that's what creates pacing and that's what creates game feel. And the second the game starts cheating on itself is usually when things start breaking extra hardcore. And where can they allow the game to be able to ramp those resources is definitely a fine line that kind of needs to be found, and like what's not working needs to also be found so that way they could just learn from those mistakes and never do them again. But based on our ban and restriction list, Bandai's not actually good at that latter part. As far as like the TCG mechanics that I generally don't find fun, and both of these are probably going to be tying into the current state of the game and our like theories and thoughts on the design flaws. um I'm not super big on protection because the whole point of a card game is interactivity, and protection cards dramatically reduce interactivity and actually start killing off specific card types and card abilities depending on what the protection is. So that's usually something I don't enjoy out of like any TCG, is when you just functionally can't deal with what the opponent is doing. And like, sure, you could chalk that up to a matchup thing, but still, that doesn't create a fun, interesting dynamic. Um,
I can
so
agree with that.
yeah. So anyone in chat or anyone who's listening, feel free to tell us your least liked TCG mechanics down in the comments below. I definitely always think that it's interesting to kind of get your guys' perspectives as well as whoever I'm talking with. Um, so, with that, we do have a lot of metadata to talk about. So, we have one, two, three big events to talk about, and then we got two smaller ones. I'm going to be skipping a lot of like just the big breakdown because unfortunately the way this meta has been developing has been, I'll just say, uninteresting because it has not been changing at all, which is both a good thing and a bad thing. So let's just start getting into it. Let's pull up the first one that we have, which is going to be the Play TCG regional. So this had I think, yeah, this was the in-person regional in Texas, and it had 214 players, 8 rounds of Swiss, not bad size-wise. And top 16 archetype breakdown is as follows. We have 5 Imperials, 2 Mother Controls, 2 Ancient Gurus, 1 Mirage, 1 Fenry Lugamon, 1 Magnamon X. This actually is the blue base. 1 Jesmon, 1 Yellow Vaccine. That's actually the yellow base, if I believe correct. Yes, that is the yellow base. And then we have 1 Black War Greymon and 1 Omnimon Ace. And then as far as the deck that actually took the event, it was Mirage. So I'm not going to be going over the rest just because there is a lot of other data to look at. And again, like, a lot of this does start coming down to matchups because the way this format's been developing, it's literally either be blue or beats blue. And we'll get more into that in depth after we look at all of the other data, because I do have like the summary breakdown written up as well in terms of like where this meta actually is at. And then that's going to lead into the greater discussion on like kind of why, but that's partially goes into the design flaws of the game and what these best decks are going to be doing. So as far as the most interesting decks from this event, obviously the two big standouts is going to be Black War and Jesmon. So Black War was originally thought to be written off as a dead deck because it has a hard time using the training cards, which it does, which without those training cards or like memory boosts, it really starts to limit what a stack deck is able to do in order to keep up with other decks that can generate those resources for next to nothing. So it's using the Agumon from BT14 as one of its primary cards to be able to get a free evolution when you have a tie tamer out. It does have both BT12 and starter deck 15 tie, so they're two black ties that it's playing around with. Black War being a more control based is that's not unheard of. They're both good in their own respects. And then what this deck is doing more specifically is it's you running Gatsomon to act as a good floodgate, ignoring the fact that the rest of the deck is Agumon based. It just felt like slowing the opponent down is better than speeding myself up, which sometimes it is. Then it still has like those cheap plays where you do have BT5 Greymon to basically sometimes gain a memory for Digivolving. So if you use that in combination with the BT14, that's kind of how you're just a +1 on memory, and you're still running your X antibodies, which is really good. The level 4s, you're also still running your X antibodies with a little bit of Promo Altarius mode, and your level 6s is the full Black War sweep, which is Black War X, and Gaiomon. And to try to top things off as a good alternative win condition, you have Omnimon X Antibody from BT10. And the way this deck is kind of trying to function is it's using a little bit of Protoform to try to make going into X Antibodies cheaper in case you don't have the base. Plus, the deck also, the way the Greymon X Antibody cards work, it does ask specifically for an X Antibody in its inheritables, and it's another way to put one in. It's still running the old one because that's the combo-y wombo-y one, but the cost reduction on evolution definitely is helpful. They are running a little bit of training and memory boosts on the red side of things. So they're only running one offensive training because sometimes you could just hit like double Tamer and then it doesn't do anything, or like Tamer and one of your white cards. So they're more hesitant on using them, but at least with memory boost, you're mostly going to always hit a card. So that's why they're higher on that. You got Crimson Blaze to try to shut off being played by card effects, which is just more copies of Gatsumon, except in option form. And then to round it out, you have, like, obviously one of the biggest tech cards for this current meta, which is Hades Force, as a way to not only just remove big bodies, but remove Tamers, which is super important because there's a lot of insanely strong Tamers that just need to not be on the field. So I think, like, it's an interesting deck. It still feels a little on the slow side, but again, depending on matchups, that might not exactly matter as much. Because if you don't see your bad matchups, then that could really help propel a deck forward. And then the other deck from this event is Jessamon. It's literally just a Jessamon deck. I honestly can't say anything else. The only real spice that they're using is they are using Fireball for more card draw and possibly low-level removal. Gravity Crush to gain some memory to make plays actually possible that might not have been otherwise. Then they're splashing in Magnamon X Antibody for the GX play, so that way GX can actually gain more immunities, which is always strong because having a big invincible wall, as we learned with Magnamon X, is sometimes just good. Especially one that could punch for a lot of damage. And then they're running the option Seken Meppa just to try to deal some more damage. So it's Jessamon. Like, I honestly don't know what else to really say. It is slim on certain Digimons, but if you're able to just find your evolution line, you realistically only need to do it once, and that's kind of just where a lot of other decks are at. It's just because of the Sistermons, you have to play a little skimpier.
Mm-hmm.
So that was that event. Then we have the Gaslau event, which I'll bring up in a second. All right, so the Gaslau event, this was ran a little bit differently considering it was on Limitless, and it was 8 rounds of best of 1 Swiss versus best of 3 Swiss. Then they did a top cut for top 16, which was best of 3. So it was a slightly different format, but it still had 8 rounds of Swiss. 176 players, pretty respectable. All the data you can find on Limitless as well as Eggman Events, which is the primary place that I get a lot of my data from, almost exclusively. When the TOs just don't give it to me, and by me, I mean a specific server that they all post it to. It's the Bandai server. That's where Eggman pulls his data from. He just organizes it. But this event, the top 16 breakdown is as follows. We have 6 Imperials, 2 Ancient Gurus, 1 Leviamon X, 1 Mirage, 1 Mother Control, 1 Omnimon Ace, 1 Magnamon X, 1 Tyrant, 1 7 Great Demon Lords, and 1 Bloom Lord. And the Grand Poobah winner is Levia X. So we all know what the majority of these decks do, but I guess we could just take a look at Bloom Lord a little bit, because we haven't seen Bloom Lord in a hot minute, and it seems like they did add a couple of like really spicy tech cards into the mix. We already know that Bloom Lord is just Bloom Lord in Quantumon, but they are actually utilizing Mega Gargamon Ace as an Ace Digimon, as well as Imperial Dramon Paladin mode Ace. Paladin mode's just good against any purple deck or any trash-based deck. It's just a really strong card to close games out with. And Mega Gargamon is just a really oppressive stall tool, I want to say, because like just stopping the opponent from digivolving and also suspending their Digimon so they can't attack is really strong. Then they are opting to use Grand Galemon with the protection to actually protect Bloom Lord, because he doesn't have any protections native to his archetype. But Grand Gale plays in with the mechanics that Bloom Lord likes, so even though it's not searchable, it's still a highly strong and synergistic card. Then they are running the Togemon X line, so they're going all the way up to Togemon X. They do have Lilith, or not Lilith, Lily Ace, but no Lily X, which is whatever, because Lily X wasn't that great of a card. I don't even think Toge X is that great of a card, but it's not bad either, just for some extra DP. But yeah, it's just the majority what we've seen with Bloom Lord. It looks like they are actually trying to go a little bit more DP focused, because they're running the BT12 green egg, which allows you to gain plus 2000 DP when a Digimon is played, which you could do off of your Sunflow or Agitar. And then obviously they have Quartzmon, Hidden Potential, Agility, Memory Boost, the works. They're running both Mimis from BT14 and BT1 because they're good. And then the other interesting tech card is they're running a Izzy and Mimi from BT5. So that way they could probably try to gain some extra memory, even though most of the time they're probably not using that ability to try to cheese into a level 5, or from a level 5 to a level 6, because that's pretty unreliable without any setup. But just the extra memory probably helps push what this deck is capable of doing. So that is that. And then the other big event is the one that I played in. Well, I mean, technically, yeah, it's the one that I played in. It was the Versus Games Ultimate Cup. I did pretty bad. But when you run into some bad matchups, that's just what happens. I saw a few too many bad matchups and did not do well as a result. So the top 16 archetype breakdown for the Versus Ultimate Cup is 3 Imperials, 2 Mirages. I was going to say Mega Gargos, but that's Mirage. So 3 Imperials, 2 Mirages, 2 Dexdorogoras, 2 Fenry Lugamons, 2 Leviamon X's, 1 Phoenixmon X, 1 Omnimon Ace, 1 Magnamon X, 1 Ancient Greymon X, or not, he's not an X, 1 Ancient Greymon, and 1 Shine Greymon. This event had 415 players, 9 rounds of Swiss. You could watch Risu's coverage on it because he was the commentator on YouTube, who also sometimes appears on the podcast. And the Grand Poobah winner for this one was Mirage, more specifically utilizing the Galaxy Loop. So if anyone's curious about the decks, I think one was purple, one was black. I'm just double checking. Yeah, so the third place Dex Dorgora was purple, And where's the other one? Oh, it's towards the end. And 15th was also purple. So they both were purple base. It is important to distinguish purple from black because they do kind of do different things. But there's two decks worth highlighting here, which is going to be the Phoenixmon deck and the Ancient Greymon deck. So Phoenixmon is the more interesting one because, like Bloom, we haven't seen it in a while. And according to the person's breakdown, because I did watch it, if you just dodge your bad matchups, shockingly, you can do well. Especially since this deck is more designed to beat the decks that beat the blue decks. So he was hoping to get paired against anything but blue, and according to them, they only saw two blue decks, one which they lost, one which they were able to squeeze out the win, because this deck still can be aggressive, it's just not as aggressive as blue. So it's not like it's a terrible matchup, it's just not favored. So keep that in mind, but yeah, if you just don't see your bad matchups, that really can help propel what a deck is able to do. And that's kind of where we're seeing birds. There is a YouTube coverage on the whole breakdown of the deck, but in terms of what the deck's actually doing, it's just trying to get up into Phoenixmon X and then just line up a whole bunch of on deletes to trigger. And then you have the loopiness of Garudamon with the Sora, and then Garudamon X to be able to give it Rush, and you also have Akiho to be able to give anything else Rush. The notable tech cards that they're running is Dinorexmon to just try to hose on the opponent being a high-level Floodgate, which is something we don't have a whole lot of because it's designed to try to shut down being able to play out low-level Digimon. And then they're also running the Gaussmon, which can slow down the use of the training cards. So it is a way to further try to slow down the opponent. So outside of that, the majority of it is just birds. Nothing else really super spicy outside of Gallantmon, Crimson Mode Ace, just being an Ace Digimon. And then X Antibody Protoforms being ran in a higher amount just because Digivolving into Garudamon X without the Garudamon Ace is important, and also Digivolving into Phoenixmon X and making sure you could use all of its abilities is doubly important. So kudos on that. And then the Ancient Greymon deck is Ancient Greymon. I literally don't know how else to say it. We haven't seen Ancient Greymon more specifically, but it's basically just doing the exact same thing as Ancient Garurumon, just being more aggressive. So you have your Flamemons with the inheritable on-deletes to play a Tamer, which is really good. And then you got Ukomon to act as a good searching tool with Bokomon. You got your Promo Aguni to be able to hide a champion in raising, move it out, swing, and then warp into a Ancient Greymon, which we have two different ones to pick from. Or you could do the alternative route and use the BT-17 cards between the BT-17 Aguni and Burning Gray to be able to line up that same type of warp play. Then they're running a splash of Aldamon just because in case you do need to evolve up, you have the option. Aldamon's not bad at just turning off security effects, which is good. And then you have your two Ancient Greys, which are just trying to punch really hard. And BT-17 is able to delete a Digimon that's weaker than it, which is nice. Does a little bit less damage, but has higher usability. The on-delete replays a Tamer versus the old one, which allows you to play out a level 4 or lower hybrid, which most likely is going to be a level 3, so that way you could get its on play out and not risk a big body that's actually important. Then they're actually leaning heavier into the OTK by running BT5 Omnimon, because, you know, when Digivolving, Unsuspend, and Blitz is just good when they have no security. Gravity Crush for extra memory gain, Atomic Inferno for extra damage. Their tech card is High Speed Plugin, so that way they could actually get through the mother walls, or like just any wall deck in general, just because jamming is, that part doesn't matter, but the not being able to be blocked is huge, especially for closing out games if you have the memory, which Gravity Crush helps with. And then you have the Takuyas that only gain you memory. So they're not running any of the BT7 Takuyas. Instead, they're just running the full suite of BT12 and BT17. So good on them for doing well with this deck, and I think that it was a pretty interesting event, even though I didn't do super hot. Still a lot of variety in the decks to be had, with some ever-growing variety. We do have 2-store regionals as well. I'm not really going to be covering them anything specific just because these are smaller events, and more weird decks can pop up because they're smaller events. So just know that JCD's Hobby Store had a regional, and Omnimon Ace ended up winning that. These are both 6-round events. And then we also have the Dugouts regional, which 7 Great Demon Lords ended up winning that. A little bit more players, but again, same round count. Doesn't really matter. So this brings us into the wrap-up of the meta, in which I actually tell you where the meta currently is before we get into the grand discussion. I know I've been talking a lot. I'd have to answer those texts later. So where did I put my metadata? Discord. Stop it. Discord. My server. In case people don't know, yes, I do have a Discord server. That's usually where I post a lot of my stuff, and you can interact with me. But as far as where the meta currently is, as you can kind of see from all of these events and all of the events we previously had, there's about 11 actual decks that are meta viable. And the sad thing is, the way the format is working, only these 11 decks are basically viable at this point. And right now, the top 8 decks is Imperial is number 1 as of right now. Ancient Garurumon kind of flip-flops with Imperial on what's number 1 and what's number 2, but right now, Ancient Garurumon's number 2. 7 Great Demon Lords is number 3. Leviamon is number 4. Mirage is number 5. Fenry Lucamon is number 6. Mother Control is number 7. Dexter Goromon is number 8. And basically, outside of that, decks are struggling really hard. But we still have Yellow Vaccine Armor doing well at number 9. Magnamon X doing good at number 10. And Omnimon Ace still popping up every now and then at number 11. And basically, from what I could tell on my spreadsheet when I'm calculating all of this metadata, nothing else is really topping outside of that. Everything else is like, I got lucky and I was able to squeak my way in. And I think that's pretty unfortunate, but thinking about those 11 decks, it's really, I guess, easy for me to say on why it is the way it is, and that's going to go into the greater discussion on where the current design mistakes are with the game. So the biggest one, starting things off before Jay Stewart starts being able to talk, because I know I talked a lot, the biggest one is kind of what he was referring to at the beginning of the podcast. Cheating on the resource system is what the majority of these decks are doing. These decks are doing one of two things. They're either A, cheating on the resource system to be able to do almost everything for nothing, which is a huge problem in of itself, or B, it doesn't matter if they cheat on the resource system because the level of protection and uninteractive elements inside of the deck or control elements are just so high that it functionally doesn't matter if they're moving slower than the opponent. If the opponent just can't do anything, nothing matters. And that's what all 11 of these top decks are doing, especially well against everything else, keeping literally everything else out from being competitively viable. So I've been keeping track of like how many decks are able to top in a format, and right now, even though there's still time left in this format, this is actually a great reduction compared to previous formats that we've had. So that's usually not necessarily a healthy sign. Some people will look at it as, oh, 11 decks are playable? That's great. And I'll look at it as, that's not when that's the only things that are viable and there's no room for anything else. So, as a player, Jay Stewart, because this is me talking from like a design perspective. So as a player, like how does the play feel actually feel in this environment. Because I have personally been struggling with just finding a deck to play. I could build a lot of these top decks, but I don't find any of them to be particularly fun or their matchups to be interesting, to be honest.
Yeah, so I'll take for example, with the Iowa Store regionals that I was going to. So I was kind of struggling on the idea of what to play. So to me, I love X Antibody Digimon. Dorumon slash Alphamon is my favorite Digimon. So I was originally going to play the Dex Daruga, and I was going to try to go more of the black base SOC that Ben got his uh, win off of. And I just kind of was starting to run into this problem where it's like, based on the current meta, if you're not a blue deck, I mean, blue decks, they love to bounce your cards to your hand, whether it be the Ancient Garurumon, Mirage. It just kind of like became the problem of, oh, none of my deck spawns in the trash protect me from getting bounced. It's only deletion. So I'm kind of SOL'd if that gets to the point. And then, so it's like, you just kind of was struggling. Like, oh, do I play that? Well, it's like then it also became another thing too was mother control was starting to pop up of all these blockers. Now, technically, yes, Dex Daruga has like a way of forcing your opponent to block, but you also still need to have enough DP to do that. And that's if they didn't force you to attack before you can even try to do that kind of stuff. So it's like, okay, well, then I was kind of bouncing on the idea of playing Mirage because it's a simple deck of you get one or two tamers out, and your opponent, if they try to check you early, most of the time you're going to get option cards, your trainings, or memory boosts on the field, and then you can just push up from the raising and just go dumb with it, if that makes sense. And also just be unblockable. So it kind of just ignores what they were doing. But I didn't like that idea, so I kind of went with Ancient Garurumon. And even Ancient Garurumon for me, this was the first time I was actually playing it at the store regionals. I had no practice with it whatsoever. I was just playing it. And there was like literally even this one game. Now I understand that, this was probably the perfect opening hand, but one game I had Promo Ukamon, a memory setter, I can't remember his name. I keep saying Koji, I know it's not Koji. I also had a Kendo Garurumon, the Ancient Garurumon, and I think if I remember correctly, I had a level 3, red level 3 in my hand too. So I just evoed into Uka, play the memory setter, pass turn, push up Uka, and then evo to level 3, and literally from there, I had 2 Ancient Garurumons, Kendo, and a Lobomon. And I'm like, oh, well, just swings, like, evo into the Kendo, do the stupid combo with that, play on my tamers, and constantly get my sources back to hand that I need to just do that again next turn. And that just seemed really broken for what I was doing.
Yeah, so like I had the epiphany that Ancient Garurumon, compared to every single one of the other decks on this list, is arguably the most fair because almost every other deck on the list of 11 decks that are doing well this format do have a way to kind of just play things for free and cheat on the game's general resource system, which is very important on not breaking because how decks are breaking the resource system basically means that they get to ignore the resource system. And if every other deck is kind of playing fair and still paying the cost of their cards, then they're just functionally moving slower than any of these other top decks. And the inverse is also true, where it's just like, okay, you could pay, I could give you whatever you want. If you can't interact with my Digimon, nothing actually matters. And if you can't close out the game, then again, it still just doesn't matter. So, like, Dex is a really interesting spot because it has the two different engines where it's like, okay, you either get a more offensive and faster version with the purple base, or you get a slower, harder to deal with, more controlly version in the black base. And they're playing slightly differently based on the two different engines that they're going to be utilizing. And you could kind of see like the speed of purple and blue is just that much greater than almost everything else in the game because of the different like packages and engines and mechanics that it's working with. Not only just to be more consistent decks in general, but because those two colors actually print some of the most memory it allows you to be more efficient with your cards, which is why we saw this big resurgence in Levia, is because, oh, Levia was never that bad. It just had a harder time into stuff that it couldn't delete, which was more previously last format, where a lot of people were playing Numemon, which it didn't matter if you deleted me, I just replaced myself. Or you're playing into like Magnamon X, which there were two very prominent and dominant versions of, both in blue and in yellow. So it's just like, oh, if I can't delete you anyway, then what am I doing? Like, nothing I'm doing actually matters. And now that at least Magnamon isn't as prevalent, and there are more answers to it, especially for what Levia can kind of do, especially on top of the fact that the best deck shifted from a deck that it couldn't deal with to a deck that it could deal with, both in Ancient Gurumon and in Imperial. That's where the prominence of Leviamon came back in, and unfortunately Leviamon is abusing the Dobermon and Cerberusmon X cards, which that little like 30 card engine in of itself is highly problematic because it just prints memory for free and generates you a lot of extra resources, which we've seen other purple decks use and abuse at the same time, which allows it in other purple decks inversely to be able to outspeed almost everything in the game. And that's kind of where blue is also outspeeding everything in the game because of how much it's printing memory. And then you get decks like Lugamon and other OTK decks where they just functionally are trying to ignore the game. Lugamon's especially stupid because nothing it does actually costs anything by the end of it, because the level 7 snaps you back to your turn. So you could just Digivolve for however much you want, as long as you're able to discard a card to enable the Digivolution chain. Nothing actually matters. So like you can kind of start to see, like, thinking about this more objectively, how the resource system and the protections that cards have are really playing into how I'm just going to say the word degenerate because there's no real other way for me to describe it. How degenerate this game has gotten very quickly. Yeah, and with the Dusk and Dawn engine, that could be used in, like, that also is just abusing the memory system of the game, where if you don't have a memory blocking floodgate out, then the deck literally just evos for free and prints memory still. So like you're seeing these engines start to prop up that's propelling certain decks to higher heights than other decks are even allowed to even think about playing, because of, again, just how much they're able to do for so little, and the opposite, how much they just don't care because of just what the deck style is doing. So that kind of also like leads into clock decks, where it's just like, okay, you do have 7 Great Demon Lords as an example, where like I honestly really like clock decks as a concept. And if you're unfamiliar with clock decks, it basically is a deck that has an artificial countdown inside of it to where it should reasonably win the game once it reaches the ability to play out its win con. So we've seen them before, and usually those are like speed checks. So it's just like, okay, if I can't beat out a clock deck, or if the clock deck is too good at stalling things out to get to its win condition, if those decks are generally like higher meta, they're supposed to like pull everything else out. Like they're actually supposed to be the gatekeepers. So they're supposed to be at the lower end of the meta, not the higher end of the meta. So that's kind of like where I'm coming from in terms of coming to grasp with my issues with the game. Just from a design perspective, because like Digimon compared to a lot of other games is its resource system is done so differently that it kind of like makes me really sad on where the current state of the game has been. And like that's it's just so hard Uh,
Okay, let's try this now. Can you hear me now?
yeah,
Okay, sorry about that. So, earlier, you mentioned about the whole protection thing. So
yeah,
for me, if I was going to take, for example, BT9, because that's when we really see protection kind of jump up and everything, whether it was the Greymon X antibody, the Garurumon X antibody, or even just seeing the prevalent of uh, Alphamon of how much protection it was able to just have. Like the thing too with like Alphamon especially, if I'm going to take for example, Doro Gray was hit because of the protection it offered and also the whole inheritable of security check. Something to keep in mind though is the Doro Gray's effect was you can only have DP protection and deletion protection, and it was only just for one turn. But if you were to compare that to something like Tyrant Kabuterimon or even Magnamon X, where it's able to constantly keep doing those protections, that kind of becomes a problem in itself right there. Or even just having even wider range of protection, where it's like Magnamon, for example, is like nothing you do affects me. Like you can still target me for like start a main phase attack and everything. But if you were trying to do Heaven's Judgment on me, or try to do Digivolve, strip my sources, that's not gonna work. And even like the whole grandest thing is like, oh, his only way to out his protection is by using option cards. Well, I just so happen to use Shivamon that gives me or stops you from using option cards, kind of thing.
yeah. Like protection is definitely a very slippery slope because the level of protection that we're seeing right now basically makes red almost as a color borderline unplayable because they want to delete things, and if deletion is the most common form of protection, well, that kind of renders the majority of what red can do in terms of its removal borderline irrelevant. And that's why we haven't seen a whole lot of red decks in the meta. Granted, I did just highlight like 3 red decks out of the new decks that were able to emerge, but they either got lucky or fulfilling holes in where the meta kind of is to be able to find some semblance of success, because right now the format is either be blue or beats blue. And unfortunately, a lot of what is in blue is hyper fast and efficient. So what beats that? Other decks that are hyper fast and efficient, which is purple decks. Purple also just so happens to have tamer removal, and tamers right now are like really important to get rid of, just because 2 of the most prominent decks being Imperial and um, Imperial and Ancient Guru both heavily rely and use on their tamers. Ancient Guru a little bit more than Imperial because you can still play Imperial without the tamers, versus Ancient Guru you kind of can't. And that's like the whole point on the draw engine, is to get to them. But the fact that they need their tamers is like where some of the holes in protections are coming from, and why specific decks are able to be, successful is in those gaps, because that's where we're seeing a lot of these control decks basically be ace decks. Control has now shifted to just ace. Because ace cards they started off as a good and healthy mechanic, and then the power creep stepped in really quickly to make them kind of degenerate in their own ways, because they just de-incentivize or turn off the ability to attack to such a degree that it is kind of forcing the game to slow down, in a sense, which like that's a good thing, but the aces that we have are too good and too splashable to the point where you kind of have to be running them, which is where like a lot of deck philosophy feels like it's turning more into Yu-Gi-Oh with engines and hand traps, that you are mandatory to play, otherwise you cannot compete.
Yeah, and even like the whole idea of like to stop the whole ace play is, well, you just get rid of the body. They would use the ace, but I mean, for example, the meta deck right now, which is Imperial Dramon, they have an option card where it's like, oh, if this Digimon would be deleted, I'm gonna Evo on top of that. So it's like it's acing without doing the whole counter timing, if that makes sense.
Well,
And
so
it
the
kind of also
other
offers protection.
yeah, the other thing that a lot of decks started abusing is protection on lower level bodies. So it's just like, okay, yes, I know you have a level 6 ace out. but I can't out your level 5, therefore I can't play around your level 6 ace. Or they,
Mhm.
like you said, have an option card where it's just like, I'm trying to out your Digimon, but I actually can't, so therefore I'm playing into your ace. And it creates like this really awkward dynamic on the fact that Digimon as a game is just more, it's getting less interactions with more mechanics, which is the weirdest thing, because ideally with more mechanics should spawn more interactions, but they actually started reducing interactions, not increasing them.
Yeah, and then like some of the new mechanics, they're more or less more of like a, oh, this is supposed to counter what is currently quote unquote a problem. And then you see other mechanics like eventually kind of get dropped. Like one of the first ones we saw was Digiburst. And even like now, like Raid's kind of been dropped because of the whole aces and everything that happened now too.
I mean, aces are, or raid is still good as long as the ace isn't able to out your Digimon that's raiding, and as long as there's also nothing else on the field for you to be raided with, like raid still is fine. It's just where we are in the game, it's becoming less and less relevant because of just everything that's been happening with the game. So it's like you take a deck like Dex Duragora, and if you're just sitting on a Duragora, sure, raid into me. I don't care. Try to delete me. I don't care. I'll just Digivolve for free in the trash, out your Digimon, and then I kind of win the game from there. Like it's these like types of interactions that are de-incentivizing specific things from being played is going into what's shaping the format, because as we saw with BT 15 going into BT 16, the format shrunk because Tyrant and Magnamon X were reducing the amount of decks that were relatively viable because most decks did not have an answer to them. Most decks still don't have an answer to them, which is why they still prop up in the meta. I mean, Tyrant, there's more answers too because they're trying to out the same style of play, but I digress. It's the fact that it's just becoming like the way we have to interact is changing into a form that is no interaction. So if you like, this is kind of where I say like Block 3 was the biggest mistake in Digimon's like TCG history in terms of like overarching blocks, because the majority of the cards that we have banned or limited, spoiler alert, are from this recent set of cards, like this block. So out of the 30 cards that we have banned and limited, about 10 of them came from block 3. Of all of the cards that are banned and limited, 15 were done just this year, which was block 3. So you could kind of see that we had the most bans and the most new cards banned literally spawned from this year, and the majority of the reasoning that they say on all of these bans and limits are one of two things. One, the card was moving faster than intended or making decks move faster than intended. Or two, the card is reducing interaction because of the level of protection that it has. That was why, that's part of why Dex Duragora got hit, or like not, Doru Greymon got hit, not necessarily this year. Uh, but like you could see, like those are the two primary reasons, speed and interactivity, on why cards get hit to begin with.
Yeah, because I know like with Block 2, there was like a lot of cards from just BT7 alone that got hit because of the fast pace they were doing. And like, the Duro Gray was one of them. The Eismons now, Calling from Darkness is another one. Just the amount of uh well, I guess Calling in the Darkness would be more of a resource kind of.
Yeah, that would be just a resource thing. It's more of like Jet Sylphie made it so decks moved too fast. Also, Jet Sylphie was really bad design wise because during that time in BT 10, Yellow was in such a bad state that they literally had nothing to play but the yellow hybrid engine and then splash in whatever fancy level 6 that they wanted, which is where the game currently is with purple and galaxy. Like these engines started propping up the second, like these engines form when the game is unhealthy because if there's nothing else better to play to be able to play the game than this generic resource engine, like, what are we doing here? Like, and I
Yeah, because
get that part of it is just that's the nature of TCGs, but not that reduces deck creativity and diversity.
I know like there's some generic cards that are, they are good for the game, like the for our game, floodgates and everything. The level threes. Like you're not gonna really be playing them out for free, so to say, because most of the time you put them in a deck, it's gonna be against the deck's archetype. I mean, Chumon is the one example that, or one defining factor that's kind of ignores that, or even the Bloom Lords. I can't remember what that level three is called.
It's Pamu. So like
But yeah,
the in engine ones are obviously better for the decks that it could run with. But most of the time, like we saw with Gatsumon and Greymon, it's just in there just to be in there to try to out the opponent. And it still also had to rely on trainings and memory boosts to be able to have enough consistency and speed and tempo to be able to keep up with some of these other top decks.
yeah, because like I know you've addressed the whole training card thing, um, but like to me, for my sake, the training cards are good. The problem is there's decks out there that are just able to really abuse how much advantage they give because the trainings in a way they're meant to more of be a comeback kind of card, the card that helps decks makes their evos cheaper because they can't gain a lot of memory. Like if you give Mirage the training cards, it's able to not only go into its level 4 for free, but it's able to gain memory because it's doing some kind of interaction. For example, the BT17 Galgamon or
That was
the
16.
or
Yeah,
16, yeah. Like, you can Evo into free for that, then effect, I gain a memory because you have 8 cards in hand now at this point. Like the training cards are helping Mirage move that memory gauge over more to their side versus like a deck like if I had to give for an example, Rapimon, where Rapimon's not really gaining memories, so to say. I mean, they kind of do have a way, but if you were to focus on just evening up into a line, they're not gaining memory from their level 4s or their level 5s, so to say.
most of the time they don't. In few instances they do, and the balanced ones have more limitations, which is why the Cerberus package or the dog package for purple, whatever you want to label it, that's why that's so absurdly broken, is because Goblimon into Dober X using the training card gains you that one memory. So now, like you said, if you're trying to be on pace and on speed with Mirage, that's a deck that's able to do it because it does the exact same thing, just a little bit differently. I'm going to Evo for 0, gain a memory. Now that lets me be able to Evo more efficiently into the rest of my cards. And then they also just so happen to be able to gain memory going even further up to make their cards cost even less. And that's part of the underlying issue with just memory generation on like Digimon bodies versus on options where you have to use it on in specific moments and instances. And if that Digimon sticks around, then you could use those effects to gain even more value, and then it starts becoming a cascading issue, which is partially why I had such a huge problem and still have a huge problem with training cards existing, is because one, they're too efficient to use as an option, and two, them in combination with the memory boosts create a play pattern of I'm going to sit here, I'm going to do nothing, I'm just going to search out my deck for the specific line of cards that I need, and then I'm going to go into my line for borderline nothing because all of my options are refunding me, and then my evolution line is now gaining me memory, so now I have even more memory than anticipated to be able to out whatever you're going to be doing.
Yeah, and besides like just training cards, for example, I think you mentioned earlier when you were talking about the regionals, there was a Galaxy Mirage loop. Like, a Galaxy deck using the Galaxy engine is all fine and dandy, But when the Galaxy cards become too generic, where it's able to literally steal your opponent's turn away before they even get a chance to even play their turn, like that kind of generic play that deck's able to do is just absurdly broken, because that's kind of like the whole. I shouldn't say it's Yu-Gi-Oh territory, but it's in a way a similar style, like preventing your opponent from playing during their turn,
Well,
kind
that's
of
that's
idea.
a that's a very specific deck that hasn't put up any results, but just the Galaxy engine in of itself does the same thing as what a lot of these other top decks are doing, and why like they just splash in whatever blue level 6s and call it a day. Right now it's Mirage, because Mirage is a level 6 that gains you memory, which inherently is part of the problem on why that variation of the deck is doing so well, because the way the Galaxy engine works is you're going to be gaining free evolutions or reduced evolutions by tucking your Digimon underneath, and you get a Digivolve into another one. Sure, you could say it requires more pieces, but when all of the low end pieces search out itself, and all of the low end pieces also make everything that you're doing on those lower ends free, that's when you're just using the Tamer to get a free evolution into whatever off brand level 5 or 6 that you want, depending on where you are in said loop, because you're just going to be going from a level 3, using the Tamer, put it underneath, Digivolve into a new level 3, gain more resources, Digivolve into a level 4, use the inheritables to loop itself, and you're basically just creating the super stack of just looping just to get free evolutions.
Hmm.
And the reason why the Galaxy engine wasn't an issue before, when it was initially released, was because, again, where the current state of the game was, Anubismon was just that much faster functionally than the engine. And the engine also, like, if you're trying to play galaxies as galaxies, it did have not necessarily the best level 6s, and now that we're getting more good generic level 6s for it to abuse, like that's only adding to part of the issue. And like we knew about the engine before, and they did do some limitations to well, more specifically to a particular tamer in it, but like the engine was always broken, and it's always just the current state of the game and the application to make it good. Because when it was first released, we also didn't have the BT16 Gaugamon to be able to generate even more resources, because that draws you a card, like it draws both players a card by default, and then gains you a memory back. So if that evolution designed for the intended level 4s was supposed to be free, now you just +1 in terms of the resources and memory, literally both aspects, on just being able to utilize that card. So you could see that the expansion of that engine is what's making it broken.
Yeah, because I know I've during the Iowa regionals, I played against opponent that was doing the actual Galaxy deck, and it's like they pushed out from raising. They were able to create this giant long chain of inheritable effects and everything going on and everything. And even when I outed that guy, they somehow got into another one. I'm like thinking, well, it's like you shouldn't be able to easily get into another one just like that. And they were even playing like Mirage in it and Hexablow in their deck too. And Hexablow was a problem for me for a moment to try to figure out, okay, how do I work around this guy? Because that's a lot of inheritables he's got.
Yeah, that's partially like why that deck utilizes Hexablaumon the best, literally next to Imperial, which I've seen Imperialists even cut Dragon mode and Paladin mode just for generic blue or green level 6s, because the rest of the engine is perfectly fine working self-sufficiently up to the level 5 to be aggressive with. And then I'll just, sure, go into a Hexablaumon because my stack is going to be bigger than my opponent's on average. Or I'll just go into other, like, off-brand level 6s because it still functions as intended, and I can just use these generically good cards to be able to out certain situations that my in archetype stuff might not have done otherwise. Although, granted, the fact that the dragon mode from BT16 is kind of cracked, kind of de-incentivizes that. But like we've seen Hexablaumon be splashed in Mirage due to the fact that it has a hard time with Mother Control, and that's just a way for it to out Mother Control, and it just works at outing other decks as well. But yeah, it's more of just the expansion of how that engine functioned to be able to get even more consistent and more memory was the tipping point on where that deck started to become like extra broken outside of what it was doing when it was initially released.
Yeah, because just kind of like I guess the more bigger problem for me is like I have no problem with generic cards, but there's a big gap difference when it becomes a really dumb good generic card that's just throwable in anything really.
Yeah, so like the way I had this conversation with Mark on a different episode, but like the way he described it is a generic card should have a overall lower power ceiling than an in archetype card. And for Digimon, that's more specifically saying like, okay, Hexablaumon should not be as strong as, let's just say, Black War Greymon, because Black War Greymon is more specifically asking for those cards that he's interacting with to be good, where Hexablaumon is not. So therefore, the overall power ceiling should be lower on that type of a generic card, because the game wants to incentivize archetypes. But now that archetypes are slowly being turned into engines and packages, it kind of just throws the game's balance on how it was kind of like designed for a loop. On top of the fact that the memory generation is borderline like memory generation and cost reduction and free playing of cards. They're all one and the same. They're all designed to cheat on the memory system, and when decks are cheating on it too much, that's when things are obviously breaking, and that's where the commonality between a lot of the top meta decks are versus the entire rest of the game. That's why you can't see a deck like Nature Spirits. Like, Nature Spirits will never be able to do well because, one, it's not consistent, two, it's not memory efficient, and three, it doesn't have the abilities that it needs in order to try to out what the opponent is doing at any given moment, because it's not good enough. And like with the protections thing, that's kind of where we as players found holes in the protections that they printed. It's just like, oh yeah, they printed a lot of protection against deletion effects. Well, blue doesn't delete. That's kind of where blue is kind of fitting in, where it's just like, if I'm not deleting your Digimon, I'm not affected by your inability for me to try to interact with you in that specific way. So that's kind of why, like, too much of a certain removal or too much of a certain protection really can just kill a card type or a removal type in general. So that's why they have to play this like little fine line with like, oh, I can't print too much Tamer hate, otherwise Tamers start becoming irrelevant. And I think like the bigger underlying issue is where these abilities are coming from. Like, if we had them like the Breath of the Gods, where it is just a slapped on an option for a temporary time, I think that's more acceptable. And that's kind of the same thing with like memory generation, where it's like it's more acceptable on an option because it's more limited on how you're able to use it versus on a Digimon body, which basically just makes it a free action for it to do. So like we've seen memory generation all the way back in like BT1 with the promo Gomamon, and that card was used because that memory generation was so good, but the out to that card is if there's nothing for it to trigger, then it just doesn't work. And unfortunately, that's kind of the camp that Green is sitting in, where Palmon is insane. But you look at Palmon and compare it to Patamon, Patamon is more self-sufficient, where Palmon relies on the opponent having and doing something specific. So obviously that one's going to be harder to use, which is why something like Patamon, just being able to do it in of itself is why that type of a card saw more play and why that color as a whole was performing better was because it just was moving faster. If everything has the same level of essentially removal, it just depends on what protections and how fast you're going in turn to determine how successful that deck is going to end up being.
Yeah, because I know the a lot of the time with the yellow vaccine, when it was like at its full power, it's literally was just if you see Patamon and TK from BT14, you're practically winning the game, especially if you go first, because it's simple. Patamon, TK, TK's effect, and just guarantee to set yourself up for the rest of the game.
I mean, literally, just that type of setup means that you will most likely digivolve into your level 4, gain a memory, gain 2 memory for doing that. So you evoed for free, gained 2 memory for doing that, and then you still have potentially anything else that you can use at your disposal to be able to climb higher faster, which is why that engine needed to get hit. And Patamon is still a egregiously stupid card, but with the limited amount of setup, it makes using him more risky. So that's the big drawback. Sure, you could high roll, but that's now high rolling. Now there's an element added to make that card less efficient overall. So that's partially why they hit the TK. But like we have packages and engines right now that are going completely unchecked in terms of locking down the opponent and moving faster than the opponent. And I think like those are some of the unhealthiest aspects of where the game currently finds itself in. And even though, sure, you could take a look and say, well, 11, 12 meta decks is not that bad. And I'd probably say yes. It from an onset, it doesn't look that bad. But you have to look at the environment in which other decks are able to thrive, if they even are, to actually like see where the current state of the game actually is, because we're heading into a new set, and I almost hate to say it, almost anything not purple in that new set, outside of stuff more specifically for the 2 ancient hybrid decks that we have, they're borderline irrelevant. Like almost everything is borderline irrelevant because the power ceiling on what we have is just so significantly high that it just none of those new cards are really mattering outside of hybrids and purple. And I think that's pretty like that ultimately will end up hurting sales. Like from a business perspective, that's what's going to end up hurting sales. So like that's why we all felt that the last ban and restriction list, while it was good, there was some really smart decisions made to it. We need another. Like what they did was not enough, and if the game continues down this type of path, there's going to be another one, and it has to be almost nuclear in order to have a type of effect on like limiting and hitting specific problems that are plaguing the game, because right now they're locked into some of the worst stuff that they don't want to be locked into, which they've tried to ban and restrict themselves out of. It's like that's why Anubis was hit so hard and so swiftly, is because there was no reason not to do it. And now his engine is in every single purple deck, so there's no reason not to use his engine and just swap out the level 6s. Like it's borderline crazy to think how much damage Block 3 as a whole did to up the power faster than any other block before. Because I remember very specifically, people were complaining about BT12 Marcus because he enabled free evolution. And he's not hit because that free evolution is no longer good enough for him to be competitively viable because of how much faster everything else is.
Plus, I also do think it's kind of like the whole Marcus thing. It also is just relevant to the meta, because another thing that Marcus was kind of having a problem with too was the whole ace play too when that happened, because cards like Battle Greymon, Ace from BT14, yeah, it's a bad card, but in certain situations, it is really good against the Marcus, because they're most of the time swinging it as a 3K Digimon, quote unquote.
Right, and that's kind of why they took the starter deck, 5 Gabumon, I think. No, it might have been either 5 or 6. But that's like because of aces, attacking became more risky, and they knew it. And that's why certain things were able to come off, is because now there's an element of risk involved to where they reasonably think that it's not going to be a problem anymore. And Marcus is in that type of a camp because don't get me wrong, the free evolution on BT12 Marcus is still insanely good, especially since now we have alternative ways to suspend him to actually avoid his cost, because before it still was somewhat of a cost because you had to pay 1 to turn him on or use the Agumon from BT13 to turn him on. So there was
Mhm.
still some sort of safetiness in it, what it was doing before to get those free evolutions. Um, and now that kind of just slowly went away, and that's partially why Shine isn't doing as well as it once did, was in part because of aces saying, hey, I'm just going to out you because what you're doing doesn't matter. And because there's a lot of protection on level 5s, Shine might not even be able to out it before it can make those attacks to do what it's trying to do. And like you could kind of see like these are the two big compounding elements to where my qualms and issues with the game as a whole are, and why I've been struggling so much, not necessarily with this format specifically, but coming to terms with the state of the entire game as a whole and my worries for it. Because we're most likely not going to get a ban and restriction list till post nationals, and maybe even longer if they feel like there's not enough of a problem for them to fix. And hopefully Japan finds something hyper problematic for them to actually look at and say, hey, okay, maybe that actually is a problem. Because I'm just hoping with unification they speed up the bans and restrictions, because there's a lot of things that need to get hit, like a lot of things that need to get hit. I could list
Yeah,
off the list, but it's actually a long list. It's
yeah,
at
because I know.
least, yeah, it's at least 5 to 10 cards that they could easily get rid of just to try to slow down the game. And then the other thing is thinking about where the state of the game is after that. So like to see if that's even a correct move or not. So it's a tough task. Don't get me wrong, but that's where the designer for Block 3 really screwed up, was how big of a power leap he made the game and how unhealthy the game got as a whole. Not even talking about the added complexities that's been going on set after set, memory matchups in terms of like how does my deck do against this type of a matchup? How do I do and perform my combos? Like we're not Yu-Gi-Oh levels of stupid, but the way that we were headed as a Block 3 is was very close to it.
Yeah, because I know during the last ban and restriction list, me and a couple of friends, we were thinking, well, I'm kind of surprised they didn't hit Mirage since that keeps popping up, or surprised they didn't do a preemptive strike against Imperial to stop it from just going berserk, kind of thing. And you can even take a look at like EX7. Like, yes, there's like Shoto and Hexablow that are really good generic cards, but there's nothing in that set that's like broken or defining like how Magna X was, so to say. Like
Yeah,
like literally, if you literally just only bought Shotos and Hexablows from that set, you didn't need the rest of the cards theoretically, and you can even tell because EX7 is basically Block 4, if I remember correct. Yeah,
yeah.
Block 4.
EX7
So
is the
you can
start of
see
Block
how they
4.
want you to. You can see how they want the power level. How they're like saying, "Look, this is how we want the game to be." Like drawing a line in the sand, going, we're not trying to cross that line. But the problem is, there's decks that have already been crossed that line.
Yes, and like it's what's really sad is we had two cool new starter decks come out that were actually trying to do something slightly different but actually be powerful and relevant. And I honestly think like from a design wise, like product design wise, they are some of the best starter decks we've had in terms of actual starter decks. I'm not talking about advanced decks. I'm talking actual starter decks. And they put up almost no results. Why? because they're not fast enough, their damage output isn't high enough, or they just don't have enough protections to be able to do what they need to do to lock the opponent out of the game. So that way, on the next turn, because the opponent couldn't deal with their Digimon, they should reasonably be able to win easily. And on top of that, their speed isn't good. Like, you look at the Puppets deck, it's not gaining memory anywhere, like on its Digimon. It really isn't. Same thing with the Guardian Vortex decks. Like, they're not gaining any memory off of their Digimon. They're gaining it off of their tamers and options, if they even are. And like, that's honestly, like, that's where the biggest design downfall is putting protection and putting memory gaining onto Digimon, especially making them easy to use. Like, that's the biggest problem, because, like, sure, going back to the Gomamon example, it's like, yeah, we had promo Gomamon to be able to gain memory all the way at the beginning of the game, but it was very unreliable on how you could use it to actually gain memory. And then you have to pair it up with bad cards to be able to effectively gain memory, to try to be as effective as the vanilla cards that it was just trying to end up being. So it's like, okay, now you could kind of see, like, bad memory management in terms of, like, putting those types of effects on harder to trigger effects. That's the balance of it. Putting it on something too generic, too easy to do, too self-sufficient, that needs no, like, any extra setup. That's the issue. And it's the same thing with like free playing and cost reduction of any kind. Like, it's not specifically just the gaining memory. It's just all of that in general. It's just making the game move way faster than intended. And that's putting heavier emphasis on each and every action that you're able to do. And if you slip up just once, that could cost you immensely. Like, that actually can cost you games way harder than anything else. And that's partially why the game is getting more complicated, is because of stuff like this.
Yeah, because like I said earlier too, like when I was going to the Iowa regionals, I kept flipping between decks because I just kept thinking, well, if I face this, I have no out kind of situation, and it just kind of was becoming a headache for me, so to say.
Trust me, it's a huge headache. Like, it is such a huge headache, and it's such a big turnoff. Like, if the pricing for this wave of events wasn't good, I would not even be attempting to play competitive Digimon, because this is, and I've said it before, and I'll say it again, this is the least fun I've had in Digimon since the beginning, and I've lived through it all. I've been through all of the ups, all of the downs. You could still say, sure, the meta is fine because you do have a diverse amount of decks, but when that small pool of decks is the only thing that's actually playable compared to other formats, where based on what the best deck was, you could prepare for that a little bit better and still be able to squeak in, there's no squeaking in here. And that's, to me, sad and disappointing, and it's ruining the creativity and diversity that I truly enjoy out of the game.
Yeah.
So, I think that's kind of a good stopping point. I know this was a really big doomer like episode. So next week we're going to be talking a little bit more positively about what we are expecting out of Special Booster 2.0, because that actually is something kind of important. Hopefully pull rates for that aren't going to be dog water, so we could actually get cards, but only time will tell on what that'll be, and that'll just give us more to talk about next week, because we are going to be getting like their pre-release event soon for it, because the set comes out November 1st, if I remember correctly.
Correct.
So it's quickly approaching us, and we basically know everything that's going to be going on in the set, and based on Japanese data, we know the majority of how the meta is going to turn out. So stay tuned next week to hear our thoughts on all of that. So at this time, I want to thank everyone for coming out and listening. It really does mean a lot to know that you made it all to the end and are supporting the podcast. Because without you, we're just two guys rambling. Um, which sometimes that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's more fun to have more ears. And thank you, Jay Stewart, for coming out and being today's co host, and hopefully the co host of many episodes more. So, if you enjoyed Jay Stewart, make sure to tell us in the comments how you're liking him. And if you like him a lot, make sure to actually leave that like if you're on specific platforms. So, thank you everyone again for listening, and we will see you in the next episode.